Before you wire money for a property in Mexico, there's one question that matters more than the view, the location, or even the price. And that is, do you really understand how the deal gets done? If you're thinking about buying property in Mexico, you've probably heard one of two versions of the same story. The first is, oh sure, foreigners buy there all the time, it's a piece of cake. The other is, no, not really, especially near the coast, there the bank owns it. Actually, neither of those versions is quite right. This video is not hype and it's not fear. It's the real process. I'm going to walk you through it in 15 clear steps, all the way from selecting the property to getting your final deed and legal documentations, so that you can see how a real foreign buyer deal gets done in Mexico in 2026. At Maya Ocean, this is exactly the kind of confusion that we like to clear up before the customer commits, not after. First, the fast version. Yes, foreigners can buy property throughout Mexico, but if it's within 50 kilometers of the ocean or 100 kilometers of an international border, then the property falls into a special category. And in these areas, for residential property, the deal is usually structured through a Fideicomiso, or a Mexican bank trust. So if you're thinking about getting property in Tulum, Playa del Carmen, Cancún, Puerto Vallarta, or Los Cabos, this usually comes up right away. That's the legal backdrop. Now let's get into how the deal goes from selection to the actual closing. The first step is simple. You choose the property. At this point, you're still in shopping mode. You're probably considering the location, the floor plan, the finishes, the amenities, perhaps even the rental projection. Or maybe you're just wondering whether or not this particular place feels right for you. Step 2 is when smart buyers slow down and actually check the files. This is where your lawyer reviews the documentation and makes sure that there are no outstanding debts or unpaid obligation, and checks to make sure that both the land and the ownership status actually make sense. Because a property can look great, but still be in a messy legal situation. So you're going to get clarity on the title, the land status, the condo documents, if it's inside a condominium, and whether anything obvious is still unresolved. And this is where buyers need to stop being casual, because once money's on the table, the questions need to get sharper, not softer. After that, the preliminary purchase agreement is prepared. This is the document that lays out how the deal is to be structured. The parties, the price, the payment plan, the asset, and the path towards closing. Different deals may use slightly different documents, but the point is always the same. This is the stage where the transaction stops being informal and becomes structured. Once the preliminary agreement is in place, the file now moves to the notario. This is a major shift in the process because now the deal moves from being an agreement to the formal closing. At this point, the notario reviews the file, checks the documentation, starts calculating the taxes and fees, and begins preparing the closing structure. If the property is within 50 kilometers of the coast and the deal is residential, this is where the Fideicomiso side of the transaction starts getting coordinated with the bank. At this point, the deal starts looking less like a promise and more like a real closing. At this part, some of the first costs need to be covered so that the deal can move forward. This usually includes some early notary work, initial government charges, and the first part of the closing costs. If the deal requires a fideicomiso, the next key step is the permit from Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For the buyer, the practical point is simple. This is one of the mandatory pieces of the process, and it normally has to be paid before the permit is authorized. In practical terms, buyers normally see this as around 20,000 pesos. After that, the notario orders the appraisal. This matters because the file needs an official valuation as part of moving forward to the final closing package. In many deals, buyers experience this as a separate line item, usually between 8,000 to 9,000 pesos. Once the permit and the appraisal are in place, the notario can make the final calculation. This is where the taxes, rights, fees and closing costs are finalized and the signing date is set. A practical way to budget for the closing costs is not to treat the 5% to 10% figure as a random percentage. Closing costs are a package. Some of the costs are percentage-based. For example, the ISAI, or acquisition tax, is 4% of the property's value. So that doesn't change whether the property is less or more expensive. But other costs are fixed or semi-fixed, such as the Fideicomiso, notary work, legal fees, the appraisal, and the registration. That is why the final percentage depends heavily on the purchase price. For example, a $100,000 property may end up paying more than 10% of purchase price on closing costs because the fixed costs take up a larger share of a smaller transaction. But on the other hand, a $1 million property may pay closer to 5 or 6% because those fixed costs are diluted across a much higher purchase price. Before the Fideicomiso is signed, the remaining taxes, duties, and closing costs need to be paid. In real life, this usually happens very close to the final deal, sometimes even the day before signing. In terms of timing, the best way to explain it is that closing costs usually come in stages. Some costs may show up earlier, a larger part may come closer to closing, and the final part is usually settled right around signing and registration. But the exact timing and precise amounts may vary depending on the notary, the bank, the state, and the structure of the deal. The next step is the bank trust setup fee. In practice, most buyers see this as a one-time bank fee to set up the Fideicomiso. At the signing stage, buyers usually experience a roughly $500 fee paid to the bank to set up the trust. And after closing, there's usually an annual fee associated with the trust as long as it remains in place. And now you sign the Fideicomiso. This is the formal bank trust agreement between the seller, the bank, and the buyer. For most people, this moment feels like the finish line. And emotionally, it kind of is. But legally, there's still one more important step to take. After signing, the notario files a transaction for public registration. And this point matters because although signing is huge, the registration is what pushes the deal into the formal public record. And finally, once the filing process is finished, you receive your final legal documents. That's the point where the process has gone all the way from choosing the property to a completed, documented acquisition. And that's the real shape of the deal. Choose the property, check the file, reserve it, structure the agreement, move it to a notario, get the permit, get the appraisal, finalize the closing costs, pay what's needed, sign the Fideicomiso, register it, and then receive the final documentation. This is exactly why many buyers who work with Maya Ocean usually want clarity before they commit, because a deal only feels easy once the structure behind it is already clean. Now that you've seen the process, here are the points where most buyers often get into trouble. Pressure to reserve before the structure is clear. Vague answers about the title, land history, or ownership status. Too much confidence and not enough paperwork. A polished property, but with a foggy transaction history. Pricing that feels amazing, but nobody can explain why. One more thing that helps a lot. Not every buyer is solving the same problem. If you're buying for lifestyle, you may care more about comfort, walkability, location, and whether or not you actually want to spend time there. If you're buying as an investment, you're probably thinking more about liquidity, rental demand, operating costs, and an exit strategy. Neither approach is wrong. The problem starts when someone is investing but ends up buying emotionally, or someone who says they're buying for lifestyle and then gets spinned around with all kinds of talk about inflated ROI projections. And when buyers are clear on which kind of purchase they're actually making, it becomes much easier to compare the right opportunities instead of the loudest listings. So, can a foreigner buy property safely in Mexico? Yes, absolutely. Thousands of them do it every year. The issue isn't whether it can be done. The issue is whether if it's being done properly. And if this video did one thing well, it should have changed one question in your mind. Not, can foreigners buy in Mexico, but rather, how can I make sure I'm buying the right property with the right structure and the right protection? That's the role that Maya Ocean wants to play. Not pushing people into making a deal, but helping them understand the market clearly so they can make the correct one. That's the role that Maya Ocean wants to play. Not pushing people into making a deal, but rather helping them understand the market clearly enough to make a better one. If you want a practical version of this on paper, we put together a buyer's checklist and a closing costs guide, which you can download from the link in the description. And if you're already looking for property in Mexico, and if you want help comparing options or pressure testing a deal before you commit, you can contact Maya Ocean directly. And if you like, in the next videos in the series, you can dig deeper into one particular aspect of the process, such as how the Fideicomiso works, what questions to ask before reserving a property, how to spot a bad pre-sale deal, and how to calculate closing costs.